What happens when your worst fear becomes your reality? Hi, I'm Brent Cassidy. Welcome to the Nightmare Success In and Out podcast, where we explore how to overcome your fears and nightmares to set yourself free. We're going to be exploring this topic with guys I was in Leavenworth with and others who survived their own nightmare. These stories can be inspiring, sometimes sad. There's some humor, but hopefully you can come away with a nugget of something that'll help you knock down some of the prisons you built up in your own mind. All right, welcome back, Nightmare Success listeners. I want to give a big shout out to all you listeners out there because I just got an alert this week that you listeners have put this program in the top 1.5% of all podcasts out there globally. That is so exciting because this is something I love doing. And I love all the feedback I get from you guys and the follows and everything that you do and the reviews. It's just all great. So thank you very much. I am, you guys come here for, what happens when your worst fear becomes your reality? How do you adapt, survive, overcome, set yourself free? What do you make of your second chance? I've got a guy here that, he made something of his second chance. I heard him the other night, Jeff Grant's white collar support group. And I thought, I just got to get a hold of Glenn and get him on here somehow. And he was nice enough to make time to do it. Glenn was released from prison in 2000. And for over 2 decades, Glenn has successfully founded and directed a handful of national organizations in the nonprofit sector, raising over $43 million in that sector. It's unbelievable. He's launched both Gym Real Estate and Gym Trainers. It's a multi-state real estate investment company and a successful nonprofit what am I reading here? It's a consulting firm to help nonprofits do what they need to do better. And he's the founder and the president. He served as the founder and president of JustLeadershipUSA, and it was all about giving people in their community a voice, showing them how to do it. And it was dedicated to cutting down the U.S. correctional population by the year 2030. I love this quote that he has. People closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but farthest from power and resources. And it's so true. And that's something that Glenn has taken that and put action to it, to put those two closer together, to make the power and resources closer to the people who can help solve the solution. He's got some impressive honors that he's gotten. One that really stuck out to me was in 2016, he got the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award. The other thing that kind of stuck out to me, not everybody gets to go to the Oval Office and visit with the president, but Glenn did. In 2015, he was invited to the White House with President Obama to talk about criminal justice reform. And he's got a story about that too. So I can't wait to unpack all this. It's just exciting to have somebody on here that's done what he's done and can share it with us. Before we get on in all that, I want to recognize our show sponsor here, Auto Plaza Direct. Who likes spending a couple of weekends walking the car lots, looking for a car. Then you spend 4 or 5 hours in the dealership to buy a car. It's kind of like a trip to the dentist. Well, there's a better way to take away all that pain and hassle of getting a car. It's called Auto Plaza Direct. They're your personal car concierge. Just tell them the car you want, what you can pay, and they'll go find that car for you. They'll negotiate your best price. They also offer you warranties and financing. It's all full service. Go to autoplazadirect.com. to get started with your personal car concierge, the new hassle-free way, the car buying experience you deserve. Auto Plaza Direct. Tell them Brent from Nightmare Success sent you. Glenn Martin, welcome in, my man. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Brent, I'm glad to be here. I'm excited about this.
The other thing I didn't say that I thought was really interesting, because I want to go back into to early Glenn, but you are from a son of a retired police officer. Is that right?
I am not just a police officer, a chief of police. Yes, my dad was a chief of police. My older brother grew up to be a federal correction officer and then a U.S. Marshal. All of that makes for really interesting Thanksgiving holiday conversations.
It does. Well, let's go back, because I know some of your story is when you were really young, like 16 years old, you ended up in Rikers, and you get stabbed a few times, but what was going on before that? What was going on with Glenn before that happened?
You know, I grew up in Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant, relatively tough neighborhood back then. We're talking about the late 70s, early 80s. You know, single parent, ultimately, mom at work most of the time, just trying to make ends meet. And, you know, the streets were calling, you know, and young people, you know, going to get in trouble. And so every time she left to go to work, I left to go hang out in the streets. And found myself on 34th Street in Manhattan at Macy's. Everyone will know this Macy's from Miracle on 34th Street. Yep. And was there to shoplift, allegedly. And walked out without anything, actually, but was grabbed by security and arrested for attempted shoplifting and sent to court in New York. And back then, actually until about 8 years ago, 16-year-olds were charged as adults in New York, one of the most progressive, arguably one of the most progressive states in the country. We treated 16-year-olds as adults until 8 years ago. And so I went in front of a judge, and I remember him looking down at me from on high in his robe and peeking over his Tommy Hilfiger glasses and saying to me, "I'm going to send you to Rikers with $1,500 bail to teach you a lesson." Taught me a lesson, all right. First of all, if you know anything about Rikers, predator or prey, that's your two choices. It is a very intimidating and very sort of insidious jail, one of the worst in the United States. And I was only supposed to be there for 3 days. So 3 days later, I'm on my way back to court. And sure enough, a guy approaches me and says, "Give me your jacket." And that really is your moment to decide whether you're going to survive. And we got into a fight. And before you knew it, 4 guys were on top of me. And one of them was stabbing me with a pen that was melted into a shank. But to answer your question more squarely, I'd say before that, it was really, you know, lack of a dad in the home and looking toward the streets to help raise me. And, you know, the streets doesn't really do a good job of parenting.
What was your dad's reaction to that? Because him being in the position he was, and then he's got a son that at a young age, teenager, gets into trouble. How does that go down in the house?
Yeah, like most people who've been in the military and then in law enforcement, my dad was relatively conservative, politically conservative and otherwise. So the idea of having a son who got in trouble, his way of dealing with that as someone in a position of authority professionally was to just come down on me really, really hard, you know, and to use the sort of shame tool to try to get me to do the right thing. People don't really respond well to toxic shame. Definitely 16-year-olds don't. So I think, you know, he probably should have done the opposite. But I would argue that the whole criminal justice system should have done the opposite. Like, those are opportunities to lean in and help 16-year-olds realize that they're on the wrong path and that they have the capacity to do something else. But yeah, he was pretty heavy-handed about it. And then, you know, my mom's a Caribbean mom, and trust me, there was no lack of corporal punishment there either. And so on top of being on Rikers, I remember a pretty firm butt whipping, even at the age of 16.
Well, and the other thing that you think would happen is that just scares the shit out of you, that you've been in Rikers. It's a horrible place. You get stabbed. So there's 2 ways to go with that. Not going to happen to me again. Or you then kind of went down the same path.
I did. I think the lesson I took away from it was, if I can toughen up enough to survive this, then I can survive anything this world has to offer. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I come from a very poor family at that time. We were on public assistance. It's actually interesting now that I rent my homes to people on Section 8, because I grew up on Section 8, which is a housing subsidy for poor people. And I just remember, I mean, first of all, if you're poor, $1,500 bail might as well be $15 million bail. But I also recognized that at that time, I was trying to escape poverty by any means necessary. And the neighborhood I grew up in, things that other people saw as opportunity, I didn't. And the things I saw as opportunity, you know, now as an adult and someone who's, you know, much smarter, I see that those were sort of the road to hell, if you will. But at the time, in the community I grew up in, shoplifting seemed like an opportunity, much more than going to college. I didn't know many people who went to college, and the ones who did never came back. I mean, my older brother went into the military, did well, but whether he meant it or not, he did not want to come back.
Yeah. Yeah. So you go in and out of these situations, and was it at age 24 that you got that big hit?
Yeah. So, when you're out in the street, you're getting in trouble, you go in and out of the criminal justice system, and you get a bunch of get out of jail free cards, right? They don't have enough evidence, or you didn't really do it. Sometimes you find yourself there for things you did. Sometimes you find yourself there for things you didn't do. But then there's always that moment where you get nailed for something you actually did. And my first offer was 20 to 40 for armed robbery years later. So I went from shoplifting to street robbery to robbing jewelry stores. And 8 years later, found myself under arrest for multiple robberies, 5, about 120 counts. And the first offer was 20 to 40. So, I graduated quickly, and I went from things that would get me a year or 2 on probation to literally an offer to not go to trial if I took 20 to 40. Mm.
So what happens?
Well, thank God I was robbing jewelry stores because I had a little bit of money. And if you know anything about our criminal justice system, money buys you a little bit of justice, not enough, but some. And I was able to hire what I would argue is still one of the best lawyers in Brooklyn, even years later. And he said to me, I'll never forget, he said, you're going to go sit on Rikers Island for about a year. So do what you need to do to survive there. And in the meantime, I'm going to become good friends with your judge and your prosecutor. And by the time I got my plea deal, the prosecutor never became friends with him, actually, but I'll tell that story in a second. But the judge did. The judge ended up buying a boat from my lawyer in the middle of that year. They got really close to each other. And so what it meant was I literally got the lowest offer possible, which was a 3 to 9 on those charges, and consolidated all the charges. The prosecutor was so angry, I'll never forget his words. He said, Your Honor, I want to go on the record as disagreeing with the plea you're about to give Mr. Martin. In fact, this was one step short of organized crime, and Mr. Martin was the head of it. There was a little bit of an FU in my mind at the time listening to him. I'm like, because he was telling me, he was like, you'll never become anything. I remember this guy took my case so personally, even telling my girlfriend at the time she should leave me because she'll never see me again, and I have no value, and I'll never turn my life around, and so on. But it did teach me a lesson. It was in my favor, obviously, being able to buy a little bit of justice. But it left me with a fire in my belly, particularly when I got to state prison, because I realized we lock up some of America's best and brightest, and that's not the story we tell about who's in prison. And it just bothered me, the connection between how I was able to invest in a way that took me from 20 to 40 to 3 to 9, and the fact that there's some really brilliant people who will never be able to buy that kind of justice. And we're sitting behind bars, rotting away, doing 20, 30, 40 life, you name it.
Right. And there's a lot of that, it's not just a few people, there's a lot of that. And it's just from getting a part of the system, they get lost in the system, and then they just rot in the system. And it takes your breath away. I think that was one of my biggest surprises about going to prison. I was one of those guys that got to voluntarily surrender. So I'm standing at the gates of Leavenworth thinking, well, let's see, I'll probably get stabbed and then raped and get in a fight, or however those 3 things will work out. And within the first hour, I had people helping me get into that world and get set up, and really wanted me to be comfortable set up, that they knew I would, my first thing my bunkie said to me was, you don't look like you've ever been here before. You're going to need a lot of help. and he gave me a lot of help. So I think that was one of my biggest surprises with you going in, Glenn, because you've kind of been through some of it. This was a longer stay. How did you go in your mindset thinking, okay, I'm doing 6 to 9 years in here? Did you go, because I know the story is that you kind of turned yourself into a machine of how do I get out of here and make myself, but how did you go into it?
Yeah, thanks for that. Like, I very deliberately nowadays don't Google people or try to figure out their history before I get to know them. Even you, I just was like, this guy's got a podcast. He wants me on. Sounds interesting. Let me do it. And then, of course, I tried to connect to your LinkedIn page. I was like, oh, okay. I very deliberately, even my staff are all formerly incarcerated people who've been canceled, you name it. Like, I just don't go into their background because you know why? Because the people I met in prison who invested in me the most, like in prison, we didn't ask each other their backgrounds, but I know that people who invested in me were there for some very serious things just based on how much time they had already served or how much time they were going to serve. And that didn't matter. Like, I wouldn't know how to use computers today and even take computers apart and put them back together if it wasn't for a guy with a pretty serious conviction. I wouldn't know how to do yoga if it wasn't for another guy with a pretty serious conviction. So I'm really big on actually not tapping into people's backgrounds and sort of accepting people based on who they are today. That's just my business practice, and it's who I am as a human being. When I went to prison, to respond to your question, it was really interesting because my premise for prison was Rikers. And there's not much you can compare Rikers to in this world, except maybe Dante's Inferno. Yeah. Like, it actually stands out as a place that's just sort of a factory of despair. Yeah. So I actually went to prison thinking some of the same things you were thinking, but even worse, because I had already learned how to survive on Rikers, and you got to be brutal to survive on Rikers. You just have no choice. Like I said earlier, predator or prey. So I'm going into state prison, yes, thinking about all the things you were thinking about, because if you've never been to prison, then everything you know about prison is what you've seen on television. Right. You know, same thing for a Black man. So I'm going into prison thinking all that, but I'm also thinking, oh, I know how to survive here. And I get into the prison and we pass the area where people cook, where the microwave is and so on. And this guy is opening a can of tuna fish. And as I watch him open this can of tuna fish, in my head, I'm saying, I got to get my hands on the lid of that can, because if you bend it in half, you have the most amazing, sharp, double-edged tools to protect yourself. And I'm just looking at him and waiting for the moment where no one's paying attention so I could get close enough to him to get this can of tuna fish, the tuna fish top. And he takes it and he tosses it in the garbage and he makes a sandwich. And I'm like, where am I? Like, what's going on here? Because this is not Rikers, clearly. And, you know, I say all that to say, like, yeah, I came in thinking it was going to be pretty scary and there was going to be no way to survive. And I went out realizing, like, the one time I cried in prison was the day I was walking out alone. And it was because of the guys I was leaving behind. Yeah. Like, I was able to be resilient while I was there and hold on to my emotions, everything else. When I was on that walkway alone leaving, it was actually one of the most jolting moments for me. And it was because I felt like I had made some really deep and important and meaningful relationships that I was leaving behind.
It's interesting when you leave prison, because you go in alone, you go out alone, but it's a whole different feeling, because you almost feel like you're leaving the guys on the field back there, and you couldn't be more excited about leaving and, you know, walking out to what you're walking out to, but you know that you're leaving behind, you know, some really strong, you know, relationships you have. So and you don't know if or when you'll see them again. So it's
my son is a Marine, and sometimes we connect in that way. It's almost like leaving the battlefield when the war is not over. Yeah. You get out, so you feel great and going home to my family and everything else. But you know that you're leaving people in the middle of what feels like a war, and that some of them will never come home.
When you were in, Glenn, I know you got associate's degree and you started education and that. Were you already crafting in your head that I'm going to do some big things when I get out, or were you just doing things to kill your time?
Yeah, I was trying to plan the next big jewelry store robbery from day one. I mean, look, if I'm being honest, I just didn't know any other way to be successful. And I convinced myself that I didn't get caught. Someone else got caught and told on me. And so that's where I started. Mm-hmm. But then let me tell you what happened. You know, I always say to people, when we talk about mass incarceration, when we talk about the number of people incarcerated, the disproportionate impact on people of color, it can be daunting, right? It can make the average person feel like, well, what can I do about that? And what I always tell people is the story I'm about to tell you, which is that everyone gets to plant a seed that grows into a tree that casts shade that they may never enjoy. And when I was going through orientation, I took a test to help me figure out which job I was going to have in prison. And I'm putting quotes around that because jobs in prison could include being a porter for the next 20 years.
Sure.
And the correction counselor looks down at my grades and puts his hand on my shoulder and says, wow, look at your grades. You should go to college. And, in my head, I'm like, oh, what type of BS is this? Like, this is one of the worst days of my life. Like, I got years and years after me in prison. Why is this guy like messing with me? And a couple of days later, when I was shipped out to the prison where I'd be doing time, I found myself 10 hours away from home, which is the opposite of what anyone wants. You want to be as close to home as possible. But I found out quickly that there was a college program there that was born out of the Attica Rebellion back in the early 70s. Like the guys who died in the yard at Attica demanded that they bring college into prisons, and it led to this particular program. And I realized that that correction counselor ensured that I landed at a prison that actually had a college program. And I just got curious. And it was interesting because at first you couldn't tell me I wasn't trying to get a college degree for the credential, right? The sort of transactional nature of it. But like anyone else who goes to college, it was so much more than that, right? It was the cohort that you're traveling through with, the relationships you build, the lessons you learn. I still laugh. So many years ago, I guess almost 30 years ago now, but I think about being in a statistics class trying to convince the professor that if I bought more and more lottery tickets, I'd have better chances of winning the lottery. And then having this back and forth where he's helping me understand how silly that is. And then finally having it click in the classroom in front of 15 other guys that are laughing at me in the background until I realize, statistically speaking, you have the same chance of winning with every ticket you purchase. Anyway, moments like that. And then also moments like, guys like, hey, help me write my paper, help me understand. Let's talk about the book that we've read together. Let's talk. I took Russian literature, independent study. Like I had a guy come into my cell teaching me Russian literature one-on-one. Anyway, you get my point. Like I was able to sort of resituate myself in the world in which I lived. And that was so much more valuable than just the college credential.
Yeah. And I've, from other things I read, you talk about reading the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and taking and thinking, well, I don't know that word. I'm going to look it up. And you, even those things, even your daily things outside the classroom ended up to be an education point that I think became the foundation that you were coming at when you were getting out. Prison is a weird place. It's a primitive place. How did you handle tough days in prison, sad days in prison?
Yeah, thanks for that. That brings me back. In prison, what I would do, I have a vivid imagination. I still do. And I think it's my entrepreneurial mind that is a gift. It allows me to imagine things that don't currently exist and to take small things and make them into something that has much more meaning than the average person. So I would look for times where I could stare out into a patch of grass and have that patch of grass mean something way more than it would mean to most people. I would go to the yard and train as if I were training for some event that I knew would never happen, but I convinced myself would. What if they opened up the prison and said, we're going to give you 2 hours to get ahead of us and run up into those hills and see how far you can hike. Even today, I take people hiking. They're like, are you hiking or are you running from someone? And it's because my imagination carried me through. There were a lot of sad days. Lucky I didn't lose anyone extremely close to me. I've seen a lot of guys lose really close family members and so on. But when you are, they say ignorance is bliss. I am anything but ignorant. Like I felt every second of the time I served. And that was the saddest part for me, knowing those years were ticking away. And I guess I would say the best response to that for me on the inside, because that's the thing that would get me down the most, was to find ways to live. Like I had to find ways to live. And I did. Like I lived during those years where other people saw themselves as shutting down and not living, I was like, one day I'm going to look back and these 6 years are going to matter. So I need to make them matter now. I don't get to do it over.
That's really interesting, because I think when we live in that primitive world there, Shawshank is such an interesting movie because there's so many life lessons in it. And one of the things that they say is, you either get busy living or get busy dying. And that is what happens in prison. You can see the guys when you walk down the hallway, the ones that are getting busy living, and you can see the ones that are just have given up and have curled up in a fetal position, and they're not going to do anything the rest of their life. So you get to the point where you're getting close to getting out. It's always a weird thing for a guy at that point, because there's these things that you weren't thinking about, and all of a sudden you're getting close to the door and you start thinking about all those things. And I've seen guys catch other charges to stay in prison because they've gotten this institutionalized nature. I know what I got here, but I don't know what I got out there. So now that's scary. What were your feelings, Glenn, as you got close to the door?
Yeah, let me talk about the piece about guys getting in trouble at the last minute for a second. Because when I found out I was getting out, of course, some people are happy for you, some people are jealous, and some people are both. Mm-hmm. And in my situation, it was no different. People were really happy for me, but there were other people who were feeling the pain of how much more time they had to do. And I remember, in prison, you trade for everything, right? Back then, you traded cigarettes. I'm sure you still trade food and whatever else, maybe your tablet, whatever you have. And, people borrow and then they pay back and everything else. So at any given point, people owe you stuff. And I had people owing me things. And I remember guys in the block saying, yeah, well, these guys owe you, so you need to go get that stuff, even if you're not taking it with you. Like, you don't want to leave prison with people owing you, because that's just going to be your reputation, period. And I can't believe I fell for that logic, even at the end of my bid. And I remember this guy owed me like $40, which, if you don't understand prison, then you don't understand like manufactured scarcity. $40 is a lot of money in prison.
That's prison rich.
Yeah, exactly. Prison rich. And except the guy who owed me $40, like, was built like Thanos. Like, a jaw of steel. And people are like, okay, you need to go get your money from him and tell him to give you your money. And I remember cornering him in the bathroom and saying, bro, people are telling me I need to get what I need to get from you. I know you don't have it. And they're telling me like we need to get into a fight as a result. So you need to tell people that you gave me what you owe me, and I'm going to tell the same story, because I'm not going to leave here with a black eye. And I was like, if you tell anyone about this story, I'm going to say that you're lying. But that's how we're going to resolve this whole thing. But I do remember saying to myself, like, wow, like literally something like this could have been the reason that I ended up staying, because, as you know, correction officers would love nothing better than to give you a new assault charge or something else.
Oh, yeah.
And unfortunately, the things that allow you to survive in prison are the very things that would allow you to fail in the world. And so what I just described might sound weird to people, the idea that you would go try to stab a guy in the bathroom to get your $40 back. But unfortunately, prison's a very different place. As I was thinking about getting out, and I was thinking about what to do next and so on. Fear. I don't want to sit and like make people think just because you were in there for years, you're not fearful. I was extremely fearful of what comes next. And then I came up with a plan, but I had multiple layers because I expected failure. And I was already starting to learn in my life that success rests on top of multiple failures. And because I had already failed many times, but I had also already been successful a few times. Mm-hmm. And I realized that if I didn't have a multi-layered plan, if one failed, I was in trouble. And so I came out, and then the reality of life hit me. And I'll give you some examples of it. So I'm coming out relatively articulate,
There's
motivated.
An interesting story, though, Glenn, when you come out, because it caught me, and it was like it was something that fueled you as you left. It was something the correctional officer said to you.
Oh, yes. On my way out, remember I told you it was a sad day when I was leaving. That day got really strange. So I walked all the way up to the administrative building, which in this particular prison was about, I don't know, a mile away from where I was housed. So really alone on the walkway with just my wheelbarrow behind me with my stuff in it. And I get to the administration building, and that's a building you never go to unless you're one of those people who have outside access. Most people don't. Definitely most brown and black people don't. And I get there, and the sergeant who sort of makes the decision about if you are the right person leaving, right, does the ID and so on. He says, Glenn Martin. And I get up and he's like, you're Glenn Martin? I was like, yeah. He was like, I don't know you. And I was like, okay. He was like, how long have you been here? I said, 5 years. He's like, no way. No way. There's just no way. I was like, yeah, I've been here 5 years. He was like, there's no way. Like, no way you've been here 5 years. I don't know you. I said, with all due respect, I think you know the guys who've been getting in trouble. I don't get in trouble. I've been working on what I'm going to do next. And then he started laughing and he looked me in the face and he said to me, you know, you being here helped me get my boat. When your son gets here, he's going to help my son get his boat. That was his gift to me. I've gotten gifts like that all through my life. And as painful as they are in the moment, they are gifts. Because my son is a U.S. Marine who owns a number of businesses, has been to 22 countries in the last 3 years. His son is going to have to find another way to get a boat. But it was a huge motivator. The truth is always a motivator for me, even when it's painful. I really prefer the sharp end of the axe. And so that was a moment where, you know, even if he was being malicious, he gave me a gift, even though he might not have realized it. And then I step out. And I make my way I'm from New York City. So you really got to think about this. So it's one thing to leave prison maybe and go back to a small town in the Midwest.
Yeah.
You leave prison, you go back to New York City and you land in Midtown. Mm-hmm. Think about it. You've been in a situation where no one's been moving fast for a long time. There's no cars moving fast. There's no red, yellow, green lights. Mm-hmm. There's no children on cell phone. Like, it was jarring, to say the least, and things that I just did not anticipate. So that's the first thing, sort of sensory overload, and that just sort of shutting me down. And then the next thing was looking for a job. Like, I thought I was one of the best people situated to go look for a job. I visited 50 employers in about 30 days and was turned down over and over based solely on the felony conviction. One guy finally said he was going to give me a shot to sell designer sunglasses. He was like, you're perfect. He was like, I need a person of color who's articulate, who's a salesperson. I think you can sell. I mean, I'm the guy who went out and raised $43 million in 4 years. I can sell.
Yes.
And he called me that evening and said, hey, I did a background check. I didn't know about the conviction. Sorry. And I was just like, so deflated.
Yeah. It's like you're getting hit again.
Over and over, man, over and over. And I realized, I said to myself, wow, is this really set up for me to go back? Like, is this going to be, because after 6 years, I started again thinking, do I have to stick up a jewelry store? Is that what's going to get me out? I already started thinking that, and I don't want to BS people, but then I'll tell you the end of the story is great, which is I went to an organization run by a formerly incarcerated guy. He built it himself. It was a small organization. And this was 20 something years ago. So reentry wasn't a huge thing. Right. I didn't even understand what it meant to be a reentry organization. And he said to me, he said, you're me, I'm you 10 years ago. And he was like, I'm not going to allow you to fail. But he knew what that meant. Yeah. It wasn't just like, show up at my office every day and I'm going to help you find a job. It was, I'm coming to your house. And he came to my house every day for 2 weeks because he knew that I was already at the point in my reentry where I was feeling, you know, depressed, lonely, stressed. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what made it, man. I got to tell you, I mean, the job was $16,000 a year answering the phone at a nonprofit.
Yeah.
I came out owing $83,000 in fines, fees, and restitution, 16 grand a year. But there's an amazing story beyond that.
Well, and I know that you went there and you started becoming and getting more confidence in every step that you made and everything that opened up. You said, hey, I might know 60% of this. Interview me. And I think in that nonprofit, you worked your way through to, was it a $93,000 or $73,000 from $16,000? But what I thought was so inspiring about the stories that you told through that was you never didn't see yourself in that next level.
Yeah. Until today, I still don't. I am a person who believes that if you can sort of figure out 60 to 70% of it, you'll figure out the rest. And I think, I've had experiences in my career that have taught me that that's true for just about everyone. I remember building a $44 million affordable and supportive house building in Harlem with one of my bosses years later. And she's a Harvard and Yale graduate, runs a large $30 million at the time budgeted nonprofit. And 5 years later, after we built it and broke ground and cut the ribbon and everything else, we looked up at the building and I said to her, I know you're smart. I know you built a nonprofit. I know how did you figure this out? This was so complicated. And she just turned to me and said, oh, I just faked it till I figured it out.
Yeah.
It was such a moment. It was like another one of those moments, sharp end of the axe, like to have someone who I thought somehow was sitting on this pedestal with all the answers, right? She was the oracle. She essentially said to me, yeah, I kind of just figured it out as I went along. So I've always been that kind of person that believes like, if you can grasp some percentage of it, and most of life is about being able to manage other people and find talented people and surround yourself by them and make them feel motivated to, move forward a vision with you. So I went from $16,000 a year to $73,000, and then literally walking off to another organization and telling them to hire me and crafting my own job. And then I just kept building from there.
So and I know, I love the idea of 60% because that means that you're taking action. And I think one of the biggest things out of anybody who listens to this, action is such a big deal, because if you're waiting for perfection, it's not going to happen. You're not going to conquer it. You're just going to have to figure it out as you go. And if you take action with it, you just get that much smarter, even if you get knocked down. And we've talked about that even before we got on. You get knocked down, you just have to figure out how to get back up. And the only reason why people get back up is because they have a reason to get back up. So Glenn, you work your way in, and what I think is fascinating is you gain more confidence. And then I think you had another mentor that told you had this big idea and they said, you're not ready yet. You need to learn more. And it was kind of like, wow, are you really serious? And then you took their advice and you did that. But then after you did that, you created, Just Leadership USA that became nationally known.
Yeah, I think that leaders sometimes get caught up in the ego of their success to the point where they lose the value of humility. And so I've always tried to recognize that it is important how you show up when you have the ability to show up differently because you have power. Like I had enough power then to tell that woman to get out of my face and go try to build Just Leadership at the time. Yeah. But I also had enough humility to be like, this person is more successful than me, and there's a message here for me. And I took that, and it was one of the best pieces of advice I'd ever gotten, even though it was a difficult medicine to swallow at the time, because I cut my teeth on organizational development, fundraising, programmatic delivery, marketing, communications at the job that I went to for 6.5 years before building Just Leadership USA. And so, you talked about leaders taking action. That was the action I took at the time that I could build upon later on to go off and move my vision forward. And I'm a big fan of that now. Like, leap and build the wings on your way down. Like you're gonna fail, but your success will rest on top of that failure. It's okay. And so that's what I did in those 6.5 years at this really large reentry organization called the Fortune Society at the time. And I tell you, my moment when I realized it was time to move on and finally do what I wanted to do was the moment I actually started disagreeing with decisions made by the leadership there and realizing that that was okay. Mm-hmm. That I can put value in some of the things they do that I think are incredible, but you can also be like, I would do something different. Like, that's okay. Like for you to be the kind of leader that puts, that gives people credit for what they accomplish, but also say to yourself, I think I'm at the point where I would do something a little bit differently and I'm ready to do that. And that's what I did. I actually resigned. I had a concept paper for what I wanted to do next. I knew I needed to be all in if I was going to build something. So I didn't wait to get a grant or anything else. I believed enough in the vision to take the risk of leaving. Mm-hmm. And it was just a risk worth taking. It was the right decision. And it was what that woman 6.5 years earlier was trying to tell me, that I would know when things were right. And that was that moment.
And that's such a great point, because, you've got to have confidence to jump, but you got to have the timing of that too. And, one of the things, and I know you've said this, patience is a tough thing. And you kind of learn patience, strangely enough, in prison, because you don't have control, and you kind of have to learn what you can do and what you can't do, but still try to get to where you want to go. And that's really what you did. You waited, you learned, and then you jumped. And I always loved that thing about entrepreneurs, and that they jump and build their plane on the way down. Just Leadership USA becomes a big thing. I mean, because you start rolling around with important people and important events, and one of the things we were talking about the other night on Jeff Grant's was the imposter syndrome. How did you have any of that in your head, that imposter syndrome? Like, am I even supposed to be at this event? All these fancy people are here and I'm the guy.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, let's start with the reason I left Fortune and went to go build Just Leadership, the sort of spiritual reason, if you will. The more people congratulated me as a formerly incarcerated person that was doing well. I mean, I'm making $180,000 a year. I'm running a third of this agency, if not more. But the more people congratulated me for that success, is the more it reinforced the narrative about other people in prison. Like, the more you pick people out as like the poster child, is the more it just reinforces the existing narrative. And I didn't want that to be in my name. And so that was a big motivator for doing Just Leadership and investing in the leadership of other people. The reason Just Leadership felt natural and actually not as scary and not as intimidating, and I didn't feel as much being an imposter, is that the organization was built in response to gaps I saw in the world. And so I knew it was, in some ways, I knew it was going to be successful because I knew those gaps needed to be filled. And it took me 13 years to figure out how to fill those gaps and to be confident that I was filling the right gaps. And so the organization structure, its programs, its discipline about what it is and what it isn't at the time when I was running it, is very much, that confidence came around the 13-year investment I made of being patient, paying attention, asking questions, learning from others, but then having the confidence to leap. The places where I'd come into feeling like an imposter was, if you know anything about nonprofits, you need to raise money. Like, that is the fuel in the engine of even social entrepreneurship work. And I'd find myself in the homes of people who had bathrooms that were larger than my New York City apartment. Mm-hmm. And looking out across the reservoir in Central Park and having it look like a doormat because it's so close to the person's window. And I've never even seen a body of water in New York from that view. Right. And then going to their dining room table and wondering why there were 6 forks and 5 spoons and 4 knives. And that was pretty darn intimidating. Those were the homes my mother worked in, taking care of those people when they got older and so on. So there was also that. It was kind of loaded for me. Sure. that I ended up in those homes, and I was there as a guest and not as a worker and not as a helper the way my mother was. So it carried a lot of weight and a lot of intimidation and so on. But then over time, I started realizing that so many people were sending me the same message that there had to be truth in it. People would walk out of rooms with me and tell me that I brought something to the conversation that they had never heard before. And I genuinely started putting value, not in my college education, not in the words I read in the Wall Street Journal, but literally in the journey in life of being in dark places and coming out the other side, successful and resilient. Yeah. And having a body of knowledge that was from lived experience. And once I put value in that, then, you know, people call you cocky, people say you have an ego, everything else. I would say it was confidence, and it was based on just a different type of education. Yeah.
Well, talking about being a guest, you were a guest at the White House talking to the president about something you're passionate about, but you also strangely got a prison experience by trying to get there in the White House. Can you tell us how that all transpired? I read about it, but I haven't heard you talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I went from reading the Wall Street Journal to being in it. I got invited to the White House by the domestic policy advisors at the time, Valerie Jarrett, Roy Austin, others, under a Black president, President Obama. Mm-hmm. And I met with a bunch of my colleagues down the block to have a discussion about criminal justice reform and what we would say when we all walked over to the White House to talk to these folks. So we get up, we walk over to the White House, and the first thing they ask is for your identification. Well, if you have a criminal record, somebody asks for your ID and they have a badge on their chest, you know, it might just be a difficult moment. Mm-hmm. And so my colleagues are walking in, there's about 30 of us, and everyone's getting these green badges they put around their neck and, you know, allows you to walk to the next step of security. And I go and I give my ID and I get my badge, and it is a hot pink badge. And I was like, oh, clearly I am being treated differently. And sure enough, everyone else was able to walk into the White House after they went through 2 or 3 more screenings. And I was told by Secret Service that I could not get into the White House without an escort. And so embarrassing. My colleagues are walking past me, some of them looking quizzical, confused. And this really tough looking Secret Service guy looking down at me from a podium sort of seat. And I'm there for 18, 20 minutes trying to call someone upstairs. I'm trying to get Valerie Jarrett to come grab me from the front desk at the White House. And then finally a door opens behind him and a young intern, 23-year-old girl comes out and she says, Mr. And I was like, yes, please take me upstairs. And she grabs me and she walks me about 30 feet over to the I remember the Secret Service guy looking down, scowling at me. And I'm like, whatever, I'm in the White House. I'm good. And we get to the elevator and she looks at me and she says, Mr. Robinson, I'm so sorry. And I was like, my name is Mr. Martin, not Mr. Robinson. So I hope the irony doesn't get lost on your audience that like this Black formerly incarcerated man gets invited to the White House and can't get in. This young white 23-year-old intern kicks the door open and grabs whoever they actually wants, and they get to walk into the White House. And anyway, I go to the meeting we're all at, and you know, those are the moments that I'm most proud of today, is like when I'm scared to death, because I knew I was going to say something in that meeting that had nothing to do with what we had rehearsed earlier that day. Yeah. And it's because I really wanted my experience to turn into some sort of systemic change. And I talked about what it's like having a criminal record and feeling like an underclass citizen in this country for the rest of my life, and what that meant, not just for me, but for other people that are walking into all kinds of other institutions and having similar experiences. And then on my way home on the Amtrak train on the Northeast Corridor, which I had taken hundreds of times, I decided that I wanted to actually write a letter to the president. I felt inspired to tell this president what happened and what it felt like and so on. And I wrote a letter. And by the time I got to New York, I was like, this is a damn good letter. Like, I was like, this letter is actually too good just to send it to President Obama. I'm going to issue this as an open letter. I didn't gain many friends in the progressive space. I got to tell you, like, there's a lot of progressive people doing criminal justice reform work. And the idea of like calling out a president who's also supposed to be progressive, right. Like I took some hits for that. Yeah. But that is the times when you have to stand up in life, when you're facing professional or personal consequences. To me, those are really important moments. And till this day, I don't regret it. It got me invited back to the White House. I ended up back at the White House in an equally surreal situation where I am in a room with Ashley Judd, her dog, President Obama, Ludacris, and a handful of other strange characters, meeting the president. But if you know anything about President Obama, whether you like him or not, when he talks to you, you feel like you're the only person in the world. He's really good at what he does. And one thing he's good at is to make people feel valued. Yeah. And I had a chance to talk to him about the experience, and he apologized, and he talked about the fact that they changed the policy, and thanked me for a bunch of the other work I had done. And then he and I ended up in similar spaces over the subsequent years.
Just a cool story. And I think it just shows that if you are passionate about something and you stay with it, you could end up in the White House as somebody talking about policy that really means something. And I'm sure the words that you spoke meant quite a bit, because the people knew that you'd walked those walks and you'd been in those worlds, and the experience was real. I know you went to gym trainers, and that's one of the things that you do now is you gym being GEM, which is your initials, and you help people, nonprofits, become better organized, how to raise more and do more. And I thought the other interesting thing you do is you've gotten into real estate, which is over 90 properties now. And I think one of the things you do is you help with that formerly incarcerated people living in some of this space that you have. Is that right?
Yeah, look, I did not necessarily get into real estate to do more social justice work. I felt like that box was checked.
Yeah.
In 17 years in nonprofit plus running a for-profit consultancy, I thought that box was checked. But I started buying real estate to diversify my income and to build wealth and to try to keep my kid out of prison and so on.
Sure.
And then when I started hiring management companies to to rent out my units, I was taking a look at their application process, and they were screening out poor people, and they were screening out people with criminal records. And, and I was like, whoa, you got the wrong property owner here. Honestly, I thought about myself as a 16-year-old going to Rikers with $1,500 bail and never living in a place that looked anywhere near as nice as some of the units that I rent to people. Like, I'm a big fan of squeezing equity out and reinvesting it in the property. And even when I was on Section 8, I'd walk into houses and they were terrible. And my units are all rebuilt, refurbished, and so on. And so I could be making more money, but I'm having a really good time knowing I'm building equity over time, but giving poor people and people with criminal records a place to live. And so, yeah, that's what I do. And I also feel like I'm still doing systemic change because I'm teaching management companies
Absolutely.
that they can, that these folks can be good tenants. And when they're not, guess what? I got luxury condos in Savannah where people rip up my couch with their cute little dogs. So I'm not sure if person's income dictates whether or not they're going to screw up your property.
That's so true. So true. I know you've got a hard break here. And I want to, and I always ask people this question because your story and what you've done and where you are now, Glenn, is one of those stories that people will grab onto. But I'm curious, what do you think's your biggest takeaway through all this that you've been through?
That when you find yourself in dark places, have faith. Keep putting one foot in front of the other. Take a look around to who's joining you in those darkest places. Those are going to be your lifelong supporters and friends. And realize that when you get out of the other side and you hit the light, and there's always light on the horizon, that you really went through something so that you can be the one to show up to hold someone else's hand later when they're in that dark place.
Wow. That's good stuff. That's a great place to end it. If anybody wants to get a hold of you, Glenn, where do they go?
Sure. They go to gemtrainers.com, or if you're on social media, at Glenn E. Martin on Twitter.
Awesome. And if anybody's looking for a book out there, I've got one, Nightmare Success. Get it at Barnes & Noble, Amazon. Love everybody's social media likes and reviews on Apple. Some about the reviews, they put everything on steroids. Keep doing that. That's such a great thing. I love it. BrentCassidy.com if you want to check me out. What's going on? As I used to say when I was writing my emails back and forth from prison, stay strong. I'll do the same. Glenn Martin, thank you, man. It was a great story.
Thank you, Brent. Good to be here. Thanks again.
Thanks, man. Nightmare Success, in and out.